Hello and welcome to Full Disclosure, a podcast project conceived to let me spend more time with interesting people than I would ever get on the radio. Although, Christiane Amanpour, given that you are now joining the global family, I suspect that we will bump into each other rather more often than previously.
That would be a pleasure, James.
You're very kind. Let's begin, I think, with questions that probably everybody who bumps into you must ask. You are, of course, currently the chief international anchor at CNN and host of Amanpour on PBS and imminently co-presenter of Christiane Amanpour Presents, The X-Files with Jamie Rubin, of which more later. But you're best known for your coverage of frontlines, your war reporting. I imagine everybody that you bump into at the moment wants to talk to you about America and the Middle East, but not necessarily in that order.
Not necessarily in that order, but you're absolutely right. I mean, the Middle East, yes, because President Trump is there this week. America, because under Trump and in Trump's hands, it's become a completely different object, a completely different center of power. And honestly, we're still waiting to see where all the pieces land. And it's not that easy because people say, oh, we know from the first term what it's going to be like. But it's completely and utterly different. The speed with which President Trump has essentially pushed the limits of executive power and kept pushing and testing to see how far the system will allow him to expand his personal power, all the while saying that any president should have this prerogative, despite what it says in the Constitution and etc. That is entirely new. And the speed with which it's happening and the sort of multiple levels on which it's happening, whether it's the Doge, the Elon Musk outfit, which is cutting and slashing through all aspects of government and even America's soft power in foreign policy, whether it's, in education and the First Amendment, whether it's in mass deportations, and clearly the overseas massive problems, which are the wars, Israel, Palestine, Russia, Ukraine, and then, of course, the trade war. So can you imagine all this happening at the same time?
Well, I don't have to, but I can't
Exactly.
I can't keep up. Can you?
It's hard to keep up, and it's hard to know where to kind of use your sieve and try to figure out what's important, what's not. In my opinion, it's all important,
Yes.
okay? Because I don't believe this, take it serious, literally, whatever it is. It's happening. He's the president of the United States. It is the most important and biggest, most powerful country in the world on all levels. And it has decided to completely rethink its historic destiny and its project. And it's decided to change how it views the world and its role in the world. And it's not gradual, it's all of a sudden.
Have you been surprised?
Yes. And I think everybody's been surprised. I'm not surprised by which is what he telegraphed during the campaign. He said a lot of things. I will be your retribution. I will this, I will that. I will cut $1 trillion. I'll get Elon Musk. I'll get, all these things. I'll stop wars within the first 24 hours. That hasn't happened.
No.
But I'm surprised that a lot of it, he said the same thing about deportations and this, but that it's all happened so quickly and that it's all executive orders. There's almost no actual legislation. And that, I think, frightens people because it looks like it's essentially his master's voice. It's what the powerful, the executive, is throwing down the gauntlet, challenging us all to say, at what point will you stop? At what point will you, the courts, exercise your constitutional authority? To what point will you, media owners, exercise your constitutional privilege under the First Amendment? Not just us as journalists who have this, God-given freedom of speech and of expression, but I believe our owners have a responsibility to protect that as well. And of course, many of them are now not publishers, are they? They're just they're business people.
Yeah.
And many of them have deals with the government, and therefore many of them are, in positions to be pressured. So it's very, very difficult. And then of course on the immigration, which we've all watched.
How are they doing, the media owners, or indeed the media? Because it's not just the owners, is it? It's editors.
I think if you take you take the executive suite,
Sure.
and they do one thing, and you take the editors, producers, journalists, presenters, camera people, digital writers, I genuinely think good journalism and very good journalism is being sent out of the United States right now. I think they are rising to the occasion.
Do you?
I think yes, I think the journalism is very good. And from interesting places, there are two big family owned operations in the US, which are News Corp, obviously owned by Rupert Murdoch, and the Wall Street Journal is doing a heck of a job in terms of really, because it's strength is business, obviously. So it sees what Trump is doing on business, and it has its own economic views. And to be fair, it's had many interviews with him in the campaigns and now, and they are completely against tariffs, and they've argued this with him in the run up, and so and they're doing a lot of work. They're really digging hard, not just into the economic part, but that as well. I think the New York Times is doing incredibly well. Again, a family-owned organization, which is a real legacy media, but a phenomenal journalistic operation, including online with its streaming and the daily and all the rest of it. And then, I obviously am going to say that CNN continues to do excellent work covering the world, but it's hard.
Yeah.
It's hard. It's very hard. Partly because of where owners stand, and partly because everybody's worried about the financial fallout. If Donald Trump is saying this, that, and the other, and all these media owners see their stock prices crashing and this and that, well, they're going to hunker down, which means that potentially it's going to be more difficult to go out to the Ukraines and the Middle East and the Chinas and all the rest of it.
That's the closest I've heard in a while to an overview that has a thesis at the heart of it. Just the bit about Trump pushing the parameters of what he can get away with and waiting, because it's one of the only theories that unites all of the potentially restrictive forces, all of the the engines or the institutions that can push back against executive overreach, whether it is other politicians or whether it's the judiciary or whether it's the media. But you make it sound like a master plan rather than just the sort of mad ravings of a...
No, I don't think it's the mad ravings. I think it is a master plan.
Is it his master plan?
I think it's his and his enablers.
Right.
I think that if you look at Project 2025, everybody said we were conspiracy theorists and that it's just a working document that Trump himself denied it.
Yeah,
like Peter denying Jesus, right? It's not, right? I don't recognize this. Yes, it's out there. Exactly. But it is almost chapter and verse, including the inordinate amount of executive orders so fast, and the whole idea of, flooding the zone, which was one of the first terms. And I mean, that's months ago, and we've forgotten that already. Throwing spaghetti at the wall, expanding the parameters. And that's what they're doing. And I think they're also now very, in a targeted way, for instance, on the deportation, in this case wrongful, which they admit was wrongful and a mistake, of this Salvadoran man who lives in Maryland. I always get the combination of his name wrong, but Garcia, essentially, sent to a gulag, which the Trump administration is paying El Salvador, who calls himself a cool dictator, but there's nothing cool about that gulag. And they don't want to bring him back, even though the Supreme Court has said. And I believe, I can't tell you this for sure, but I think it's because they want to make an example. They want to say, if we can do this here, don't any of you try. Yeah. They want to make examples of various things. Look at the crackdown on the academic higher education institutions, from Harvard to Columbia. Some are standing up,
and some are not.
And that's a problem.
To what end, Christiane? What I mean, if it's a plan, if it's a roadmap, what's the destination?
Well, the destination, I think, is to change the culture. I mean, I think that the only way that I can understand America, being that I'm not American, nor do I cover inside America. In fact, I've been wrong. I was wrong about who was going to win the election several times. But I do believe it's a struggle for the soul of America. I heard somebody say that, and I think it's true. Or the mind of America, or whatever it is. It's a struggle to define what it means to be an American in 2025 and trace it all the way back, if you want, to the beginning of the 20th century, but all the way back to the founding of the Republic, and even before, with the Native Americans and what happened with them, and then the slavery and this and that. All these massive issues, massive historic issues that have never been so much as addressed, much less resolved. And I think that there is a big competition between those people who believe that the Constitution gives them maximalist power, or they don't care what the Constitution says, and those who believe in the written word of the Constitution and believe in human rights, believe in diversity, DEI, a crappy acronym, I'll give it to you.
Sure.
But what does it mean? It means leveling the playing field. I'm a woman. I'm caught up in that. Black people, people of color, people of different, sexual preferences and etc. This is all about trying to build an inclusive nation. But for many, it has just been gone too far. And then this other awful word, woke, has caused essentially this culture war, or stirred a culture war that's always existed in the United States. And these guys are hammering back.
The perception that society has tried too hard to accommodate difference and diversity.
I think so. And tried too hard.
Which it hasn't, of
which
course.
I don't think it has. But maybe people think that the whole debate over toilets, the whole debate over pronouns, the whole debate over words, how you describe things, that's just, they think, a level of burden that they don't want to deal with. They can't see that it's because for centuries, not just in the United States, but all over the world, minorities have not had a fair and just shake. And the world, we know this from every single, just take the economic data from the IMF or the World Bank or whatever you believe in. They'll tell you that diversity in any endeavor, any human endeavor, from business to government to whatever it is, increases the pool and increases the pot of prosperity for everybody.
The woke thing and the trans thing, which you've just raised, it was a gift to Donald Trump's enablers, the whole transgender conversation, because it is more complicated and more nuanced than all of the other isms, the racism, the sexism, much more. And yet, if you ask people to define woke or to give you egregious examples of wokeism, they can't do anything but mention the things you've just mentioned, the pronouns, the toilets, the meaning. So there is no woke. There is just this attempt to pretend that the perceived overreach on trans issues
some people are just offended.
Exactly.
Some people are just offended that they don't get the right to rule the world.
Bingo. And that is why I wonder, when I asked you what the destination was, when do these men, and it is mostly men, when do they sit back and say mission accomplished?
It's a good question. But it is, I think we have to be very conscious that this is a clever, thought out plan, whether it was the Federalist Society that for decades worked to promote the elevation of conservative judges and found in Trump somebody who didn't have their religious views necessarily or even their political views, but was somebody who, in return for their support, the Christian evangelicals, all those people in that domain and in that community, promised them, it's typical politics, right? But this was politics with a cultural mission. So, look at the Supreme Court, 6-3. It's going to be 6-3 forever. It's not balanced. And I'm not saying it should be 6-3 the other way, but it's not balanced. And that has brought, taken away rights from women, taken away civil rights, threatening voting rights, all sorts of stuff.
And it never ends. I mean, until what? Until he has the same sort of power as the Saudi king that he's currently paying court to.
It's hard to tell.
It is, isn't it?
Well,
but have you stopped? Have you managed to shed your normalcy bias? Have you started to think?
It's not. I don't think it's normal at all.
No, what I mean is, we will return to normality. This will only be an aberration. There's no way it couldn't happen here. We're back to Upton Sinclair.
Yes,
all of it could happen in the United
I will say that I used to be like that.
Yeah.
Certainly in the first term. and we sort of phew,
Yes.
people will say, wow, okay, the world survived that. Because there were a lot of aberrations there, but nothing compared to right now. I do think from everything I've been reading and everything that I've experienced from traveling around the world and living in these kinds of societies and reporting on these societies, where you have the strong man in whatever form or fashion, an elected dictator for life, essentially, right? It's very, very difficult to turn back the clock, even after only a few years.
Yeah.
And I read this recently and interviewed about it, just with regards to Poland, in Europe. They had for a long time, I can't remember whether it was 8 or 12 years or whatever, but they had a very, very conservative government, you remember. And then the last election, they elected more centrist, more liberal government. And in areas that the conservatives had worked so hard, which are the areas of the judiciary, you have to really go for the judiciary, in areas of the press, in areas, that underpin any kind of society. They had changed it so fundamentally that it is difficult to roll it back. They're trying in various areas, because actually it was outside the norms of what the EU rules are for membership. So for that reason alone, if no other reason, the Polish authorities are trying to reverse some of that excess. But that excess exists in Hungary. There's a trend that Trump is actually, helping some, but not helping others. There's also a reverse trend in Australia, in Canada, in other places. So again, I genuinely think it's a battle for the nature of who we are as people and as democracies. And I think it's on both sides the battle is being fought.
And all of the administrations and individuals on what we'll call the other side, that they all bend the knee to Moscow.
Do you mean the Hungaries and all the rest of it? A lot of them do. Yeah, for whatever reason. Part of it is historic. Part of it is conspiracy. Why should we,
shared interests on just simple things like instability.
Simple things, even cheap oil.
Yeah.
Things like that in this day and age. It's a shame, because when you can't get people who call themselves democracies, who live by European rules, who believe in the rule of law, and that the fundamental rule is thou shalt not invade thy neighbor. There's only one answer to that. And yet some in Europe are unable to see that Russia is wrong here. Russia's the aggressor and should be confronted.
Has all of this ever felt in the course of your career as global and interlinked as it feels now? So when you're in Bosnia, or when you're in Ukraine the first time round, or when you're in the Gulf War, they felt, to outsiders, to consumers of news, they felt like self-contained events. Now it feels like everything is, if not linked, then at least related.
I think there's truth to what you're saying. I would say also that in those years where I was first active as a foreign correspondent, it was the immediate post-Cold War years. So we really had what President George H.W. Bush called a New World Order. And again, that was another thing that everybody had to reckon with. But it seemed, as they say, the arc of justice, the arc of history bending towards justice and freedom and economic prosperity and more equality and this and that, and more information, not just your state-run propaganda, but access to travel and to seeing things with your own eyes that you maybe only heard about on the BBC World Service or Voice of America, which, by the way, now they're threatening, in the United States.
Course.
These are very important pieces of soft power. So I would say when I first started, you felt that you were entering actually an interesting, new and positive world order. And I guess what I wasn't prepared for and didn't see coming was the backlash. The backlash has been huge and knock you over the head with a hammer. And, you've had years in the 90s of peace and prosperity, plus real problems. Rwanda,
Well, that's what I mean by being
yeah.
isolated incidents rather than part of global tides and trends.
Yes, and I think now it's much more
Back to global trends and tides.
Yes, but at the same time, another way people are trying to decipher Trump is it about spheres of influence? Is this where we're going to end up with? I was just speaking to a friend of mine who's very, very plugged in at the UN and has perfect pedigree at the United Nations. This year, I believe in September, is the 80th anniversary, right? And there are real doubts about whether the United Nations can survive, at least in this current format. And what will that mean? And at the same time, people are, and funding is at a critical level. I mean, they're out of funding right now. Some countries haven't paid their dues. Maybe they will, but they're out. They're very, very bad right now. Some people believe that Donald Trump is one of these, late 19th century spheres of influence, early 20th century spheres of influence kind of guys, and that he is happy to let, eventually, once he's clobbered them over the head a bit, Xi take Asia Pacific, Putin take what we might as well call Eurasia, if Putin takes it, Europe, Asia, Russia, etc. Not sure what happens to, Southeast Asia, India, and etc. And the United States takes the West and hunkers down behind all the West. This West doesn't necessarily include Europe. And that, I think, is scary. I do, because whatever the problems with Europe, and of course we in the UK know that there was a whole referendum fought on this, it is still a project that was designed to guarantee peace on the continent, that has 500 million inhabitants, that is a huge voting bloc, that has so much power and ability, and to crash Europe again, I think will be very, very problematic.
How do you work through the obvious tension between all of this being professionally absolutely fascinating and yet personally? And I know you've also spoken about how becoming a mother changed the way you looked at a lot of your professional interests. But so professionally brilliant, fascinating, great for business. Personally terrifying, bad for the soul.
I'm not sure whether it's great for business this time around.
Okay, go on.
Well, I'm noticing that ratings in the United States are not what they were in the 2016-2020 cycle of Trump. They're not. And partly is because people are tired and scared and feel sort of a bit depressed and dark, partly because of the increasing fragmentation of the media landscape and of the podcast business and the alternate media, essentially. So I think that I'm not terribly sure that it's good for business at the moment.
Not in a commercial sense, but in the sense of you
in
getting your
terms of
intellectual
journalism.
teeth into something and
in
deriving
that
enormous satisfaction from that. It's great for business.
In that regard, yes. I'm not sure about satisfaction, but because it's quite scary. But I am really, as a curious reporter, interested to see where this all falls down. And the first major marker, James, will be in a couple of years during the midterms. That's the first major marker. If things don't change, President Trump's ratings are very, they're not in the toilet, but they're not where he would want them to be at this time in his presidency. And I think that's something that they're saying, hang on, we didn't sign up for all of this. And I'm not saying his base, because MAGA are true believers.
Yes, of course.
But I'm talking about the people who gathered outside MAGA to put him over the top, because you can't just win with MAGA or just Republicans. You have to have the independents, you have to have the disaffected Democrats, all of that kind of stuff. So, and the other coalition Obama coalition who decided to defect. So I think that, the whole silly slogan about you don't need 250 pencils, how about 5 pencils? You don't need $30, what about $3? It's frightened people because they're saying, hang on, is it Scrooge? Is our Christmas and Thanksgiving going to be ruined? But more than that, are we going to be poorer? Are we going to be worse off? We voted for him to make us better off. So that's his challenge, like any president. It's true. It's a truism, huh? It's the economy, stupid. It genuinely is.
And it doesn't matter to the base that he might accept a $400 million aeroplane from the Emir of Qatar, that even as he's telling them that they won't be able to buy their children dolls.
Yes, I think he's framing it in this is for the presidency, it's for the good of the country, all the rest of it. But he did actually answer a direct question, and he said, what are you, fake news, asking me that question? That's a stupid question. I'm paraphrasing. I don't have the exact answer. But he said, in golf terms, if you're given the putt, you take the putt and run with it.
Yeah.
That's his answer.
So there's no sort of question of a moral dimension or of
Are you surprised?
precedent and intent. No, I'm not remotely surprised by it, but I'm always surprised by the people you referred to at the beginning of this segment, the ones who still seem to subscribe to the idea that you don't need to worry about what he says, only about what he does, or how much does he have to do before you start acknowledging that he does what he says
Exactly.
he's going to do. It's been extraordinary to
I will
watch
say, there are some who have fought back, as we've said, some of the academic institutions. I think the press is doing a pretty good job under these circumstances. But also, the senator who got up and went, it was his constituent. This is not a vanity project.
Yes.
It's not for scoring points. It's not performative. That was his duty. Senator Van Hollen got up and went and insisted on getting access to his constituent. He's a senator from Maryland, and Garcia was his,
Yes.
Abrego was his constituent. And then, of course, the guy who calls himself the coolest dictator, Bukele in El Salvador, created this, as you remember, this photo opportunity with margaritas and umbrella drinks, and say, see, they're just fine. Of course, this was all a photo op. But it looks like Van Hollen at least got him out of that place, and now they've got to figure out how to get him back to the United States.
When you were in your sort of in your pomp on foreign battlefields, and the phrase that I always remember of yours is the idea that journalists should be truthful, not neutral.
Yeah.
Which is true in places like Rwanda and
Yes,
Bosnia in
yes.
times of genocide.
Yes.
It's true in the States now, isn't it?
I think it is. I think you can apply that almost to everything. Not everything, because it's usually on big matters of state or international humanitarian law or those kinds of violations, where there is no equating, victim and aggressor, etc. But I do believe that even in climate discussions, you cannot do this both-siderism, because it's not true. It's not truthful. It might be neutral, but it's not objective. It's not even impartial. It's actually a lie. And I learned that in Bosnia, when you try to equate the people, and we're talking, elderly men who were not frontline soldiers, women and children who were in front of our eyes being sniped to death, shelled, and otherwise besieged and starved by the enemy, the Bosnian Serbs in the hill, for years. Everybody, the rest of the world, the leaders at the time didn't want to do anything about it, didn't want to intervene. So accused us all of going, over the other side, or in those horrible days, she's lost her objectivity, or even worse, And I had to really think about what objectivity meant in these extraordinary, stressful conditions and moments. And I just said, if you're not willing to be truthful, then you're an accomplice to the worst kinds of atrocity. And I'm not willing to be an accomplice, so I'm going to call it like it is. And that's what I've done with my career the whole time. And I'm pleased, because it gives me clarity, and it doesn't make me wobble, which is not to say there are not many, many difficult issues that you have to really grapple with. But it gives me clarity, and I think in the United States you can use that a lot as well.
There were also, of course, accusations of a loss of objectivity when you married Jamie Rubin.
You mean Christiane Amanpour presents the X-Files with Jamie Rubin?
That guy, that guy, because people wondered whether or not, given his role at the time, he would be Assistant Secretary of State for Public Affairs under President Bill Clinton, and a key US foreign policy spokesperson, whether he was possibly pushing things in your direction.
Well, you are right, James. There was a bit of a controversy at the beginning, and we proved that it didn't have to be a problem, that because his job was actually to be forward-leaning towards journalists, he knew how to speak to journalists, and on matters that he didn't and wouldn't discuss with me, he just told me what he would tell the New York Times. Interestingly, the New York Times came down. Actually, it could have been, I think they said it's awkward but not improper, something like that. So I think that was pretty good as well, because in those days, once the New York Times gave you a blessing, you were pretty much home free. And I in my youthful arrogance, shall we say, I thought, hang on, I'm the one who's telling them things.
Yes.
I'm in the field. I'm in Bosnia and Rwanda and all those places.
Things that they can't get access.
They could just look at my reports every day. Of course, I mean, that was a little bit over arrogant, but nonetheless, that's how I felt about it. I didn't feel the need to and also it would have been it would have been wrong, and it would have been uncomfortable, and it would have been stressful, and it just wouldn't have been good on a personal level to try and pull those things out of him. But I think that it would never have been allowed today. In our instant judgment era,
Oh, that's
in our
interesting.
social media era, everybody and their brother would have some view
They would
about
have just
this.
thrown so much
So
at you
much
both
at it.
that it would have broken. It would
Yes.
have been unsustainable.
Possibly for our leaders, not for me,
Of
because I
course.
don't pay attention. I don't get broken
No, but
by social media.
sorry, guys. I know there's nothing going on here, but it's about the perception of wrongdoing and the
Right.
amount of, a bit like Macron having to establish this morning that he wasn't taking cocaine on a train with Keir Starmer, and
I mean, that's just so ridiculous.
but it
I
wouldn't
can't
have
even
happened
believe it.
in a previous universe. That level of
I mean,
misinformation
yeah.
and propaganda,
disinformation
Yeah.
and propaganda.
Yeah.
I mean, look, I will tell you that, Jamie had an exceptional boss in Madeleine Albright who
Yes.
fully trusted him. She was an exceptional foreign policy stateswoman, diplomat, and human being. And I had an exceptional boss. The head of CNN was exceptional. And he trusted me. Tom Johnson was a brilliant ally. And he trusted me. And by the way, he had been in the Johnson White House, Lyndon B. Johnson White House. So he had seen, what it's like. He had seen relationships in the White House. I want to say Doris Kearns and her husband, Goodwin, they both worked in the Johnson White House. But there were historic past, precedents, and here we are. But I think now it would have been too much for the social media world to
I agree. That's
to
really
cope
interesting.
with. Yeah.
I just for the benefit of people listening, one of the reasons why this episode of Full Disclosure sounds a little bit different to previous ones, if you didn't know, is because Christiane has been here before, and we covered the journey from Ealing in West London via Tehran and the journey that you took into becoming a journalist and the various stops along the way. So that's already in the
archive.
on the record. We didn't get on to how, as a direct consequence of your relationship with Jamie Rubin, how becoming a mother profoundly changed the way you thought about your work. I think you've described it as giving your life meaning beyond journalism.
I think that's absolutely true, and it remains true. My son is now our son is 25 years old, and we are incredibly proud of him. And he is a really exceptional, compassionate, smart, young man who wants to do the right thing, wants to, does a little journalism, is really mostly into film. He wants to be a writer, director. He knows it's difficult. But you know what? He's doing something which is a beautiful story. I took him when he was 17. It was his half term. I took him on a work trip of mine to Jordan, and it was the Syrian refugees in camps in Jordan, refugees from the war there. And he met a young Syrian refugee because I was interviewing the family. They were exactly the same age. Mohammed from Syria, who lost his father and became the head of the family with his siblings, and essentially was expected to look after his mother and the rest of the family at 16 in a refugee camp in Jordan. And my Darius, 16, nearly 17, with a completely different, life expectation in terms of what he would be able to do and, the freedoms he had. And he bonded so closely with this young man his own age, and they stayed in touch. And now he is going to tell the story of this coming of age between the two of them, mostly because young Mohammed wants to take his family back to Syria now that Bashar Assad has fallen, and go back and find the land that his father had to leave, his father's land that they had to leave. There was a house that's being constructed and a whole new life. I just think it's brilliant. It's just so beautiful. I'm so proud.
And of course, as a traditional foreign correspondent, that would have been off limits, that level, that sort of personal relationship and that sort of
Although
allowing your empathy to define your...
Yes, but no. I think empathy is a very underrated quality.
Sure.
And I do believe that you cannot be a successful correspondent, but especially a people-facing correspondent, when you go into the worst, most difficult places in the world and watch people suffering so much. You cannot be completely and utterly like a block of ice.
Do some of your cohort try to be?
I think things have changed.
Right.
I think since I started, that rule has changed a bit. Sometimes over the top. People over-emote. People over-perform. But I think in general, we are a group of people who go there because we believe in championing the underdog as well as telling the truth. And we believe still that the power of our medium gives our voice amplitude and on behalf of people who don't have a voice. And that's I'm going to say my defining mission. I know many, 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 many of my colleagues feel that way. Otherwise, we wouldn't do it. It's not just for the kicks.
But it was becoming a mother that changed the way you
Well,
do
it just made me more, scared. I didn't want to lose my life in the battlefields,
Of course.
and it made me, yes, more empathetic, but more visibly emotional and empathetic, because I couldn't stop myself reacting when I saw kids in deep distress when I had a kid at home.
I think that's really interesting because, I mean, you've been so outspoken in your career about equality and about how much harder it is for women, and about how macho, it's a word you often use to describe journalism in your early career. And of course, a man wouldn't say that about becoming a father, or if he did, it would be remarkable.
But he might now. He might not have then. 25 years ago, 30 years ago, I started, in the first Gulf War. That was 1990, 91. And yeah, it was different then. But I think underneath, and you'll hear the stories now, many men found it very difficult to be away from their kids. And many men regret that they didn't have, that they felt they weren't able to have and demand that time at home with their kids, that was their role, that they had to go out and do that. Some did it willingly, obviously, and everybody does it willingly, but some were predisposed. But many men, I think, now talk about it. Certainly a lot of my colleagues are much more open, my male colleagues are much more open about family matters and what matters and how being a father, also, as I say, being a mother, changes your worldview and your outlook and your empathy level and how you will see another family's reality.
Yeah. How would you feel if Darius announced tonight that he actually wants to go to Kyiv, or he wants to go to Gaza?
I would be so proud.
Would you?
Yes, I would.
But you'd also be terrified.
I would be afraid, but I would be proud. I have no right to stop him except to give advice, because I think I put my parents through this horror and fear. Yes. Without ever so much as saying, "Mommy, do you mind if I go here, there?" I just did it, and they were so good. They never, ever complained.
No pushback at all. Can you remember the first time you told them that you wanted to be a war correspondent?
Yeah, and I don't even know that I told them that. I said foreign correspondent,
Right.
But I think the first time, and they were. The truth is, they were thrilled because they got to see me. They were living here in London by that time. We'd had to leave Iran, the Islamic Revolution, etc., and they were set up here in the UK. My mother being English, and when they saw me on cable television, and they were so proud.
She's okay.
That's true. That too.
She's eating.
That too.
she's
too.
healthy.
They could see how I was doing. Exactly.
That's nice.
It was really nice.
Which I suppose brings us to Darius's dad, who is no longer your husband,
yes,
but is your collaborator on the new podcast.
Yes.
Is there a bit of divorce dynamic in the title? Christiane Amanpour presents The X-Files with Jamie Rubin.
Yeah, I'll leave that for you to decide.
Decided.
Yeah. I had this idea. It's fantastic that Global was open to it. And I took it to Jamie because I thought, who could be a better collaborator on this? Because the idea was to essentially do foreign policy through our shared experience, which spans about 35 years, from 1990 to now, when he was in the Clinton administration at the beginning of the 90s, and I just started my foreign correspondent career, and all that's happened since. And he's gone again he was in the Biden government. And the reason I reached out to him was because when when Kamala Harris lost to Trump, that meant Jamie was out of a job. He's a political appointee as opposed to a civil servant, a foreign service. And I said, wouldn't it be great, because I'm so tired of just talking about today's conflict, as if there's no history, as if there's no past, and as if there's no future. We did stuff and saw stuff. You saw it from how it was resolved diplomatically or not, I saw it from what it was like to report on the ground, whether it was Bosnia or Kosovo or, Rwanda, Somalia, Haiti, all those issues, the Middle East, for heaven's sake, with Oslo peace accords. There was a time, and there can be a time, that this can be resolved. So I thought it would be fun and interesting to talk about today then branch out into our stories from yesteryear, and to tell the stories of what worked and what didn't, and then sort of see whether we could wrap it up in terms of the final part of our conversation would be about what are the solutions or consequences to what's happening.
Because that's often missing, isn't it? That third bit.
Yeah.
And I think the mission statement you've come up with is finding clarity in the chaos.
Mm-hmm.
Well, there's no shortage of chaos.
There's none.
It's a pretty good time.
Yes, but you know what?
Go on.
It's all people focus on.
Yeah.
They forget that actually there is clarity to be found if you work hard enough at it, if you're patient enough, either as a diplomat or as a journalist, any kind of leadership position. And there are instances which you can go back to in the past, in the not too distant past, and say, wow, that worked. Why don't we try that again?
And that's reassuring.
Yes.
The lessons of history. I interviewed Ian Hislop years ago.
Yes.
And at the time we were in the middle of Brexit and everything felt awful. And I said, how do you manage to put out a magazine that every fortnight that's funny when everything's so unfunny? And he referenced the classics. He talked about how everything's happened before.
Yes.
Everything is cyclical and everything. I don't know how uplifting that is for everybody, because you sort of think, well, that means there's never going to be a permanent period of peace or a permanent period of happiness. But history does teach you that however extraordinary things feel, they're not unprecedented.
I actually do believe that.
Yeah.
At the same time, we, the following generations, are not static.
Sure.
We're trying to figure out, modern day solutions or workarounds or whatever it is. But I do think that is actually also gives you a bit of comfort. Obviously, we've come, so far in terms of peace, prosperity, and human happiness and longevity and all the rest of it since the classics. So we have made progress. And I just don't want to be stuck in the dark, depressing now of war, pestilence, and I mean it,
Yes.
COVID and all the rest of it, and the casting aspersions against, pandemic control and vaccines and this and that. No. We cannot go back to that. We have to be able to, convince people. But now it is more of a job of convincing. And I do think one of the things that leaders need to get better at, and I don't mean performance, I mean genuinely really believing and telling the stories of what works. And I think one of the things that the Bidens did incredibly badly, because if you look objectively, they did a lot of legislating, they brought down inflation, they brought down, there was a lot that you could put on the positive side of the ledger, and they didn't tell the story. I mean, it was really pathetic. And I think in today's world, especially when it's all about storytelling in one way or the other, and you're competing to the death with the alternative media sphere that tells lies and propagates disinformation, misinformation, conspiracy theories, and frankly, in my opinion, is bigger and stronger than real news.
Oh, yes.
It takes the real news and the leaders of today to be even more diligent and capable of telling the story of why, let's just say, government works, or this piece of diplomacy works, or aiding Ukraine. I mean, obviously, in Britain, everybody's convinced.
Sure.
But you can tell America that story too, why it matters. It really matters.
Why have you described the conversations that you'll have with Jamie as conversations you couldn't have before?
Only because
just because of the jobs you had, or
only because a lot of it is pulling back the curtains, backstories, stuff that didn't get on the air from me, weren't told. I mean, this current episode that just drops on Tuesday the 13th, you'll hear a story about Jamie about diplomacy at the end of the Biden administration, the last 9 months, that could have ended this war between Israel and Gaza. The Palestinians were on side, the Israelis were on side, the Arab leaders were getting on side, and in the end, the Palestinians, according to Jamie, essentially there was some over-negotiating going on, and then they ran out the clock, and Trump won, and that was that.
it was too late.
Yeah, for this particular idea. But it was a good idea, and frankly, everything goes back to the original ideas, which is part Oslo, part Camp David 2000, and part the Clinton parameters. Those which basically lay out maps, the sharing, the security, the sovereignty for two people. And under this plan that Jamie will discuss for the first time during our podcast, the United States was ready to go to the UN for the first time in its history and declare support and try to get a resolution for a Palestinian state.
Well, that's the perfect example, isn't it, of
Yeah.
something that's simultaneously uplifting and depressing, because it could happen, which is good to know.
Well, let's convince Trump.
And it did. Well, good luck with that.
Hey,
And,
maybe.
I mean, you've led us there, so we should close there in Gaza. I mean, it is now post-Trump or mid-Trump. It's possible there won't be anything left to share, or there won't be anything left to negotiate over.
Well, look, there is no doubt. All you have to do, unfortunately, and I think it's wrong. And by every Israeli guest I have on my program, an official guest, I ask and pretty much demand that we be given, as international correspondents and news organizations from around the world, access into Gaza like any democracy would allow, right? Israel's a democracy. And that has not happened. Our heroic colleagues, and they are heroic, in Gaza, who have been, killed and died over the last 18 months, hundreds of them, and injured, have had to carry this huge burden. But unfortunately, it's not enough. They need help, they need support, they need sustenance from all of us. So I think that you can see the level of destruction. You can hear what the Israeli Prime Minister is saying, even before Trump's visit, as if to sort of lay the groundwork. They passed in the Security Cabinet, I think, something called Operation Gideon's Chariot, which is about, essentially, as they've described it, moving all the Palestinians into one small part of the south of Gaza, trying to create a depot in another part, administered by private security and the IDF, Israeli soldiers. It's a bit of a recipe that the UN wants nothing to do with it. Aid agencies want nothing to do with it. But the place has been devastated. So it'll take a huge amount of help and goodwill to fix it back up.
Is there ever a point at which you wouldn't have Israeli government representatives on your program?
No.
You don't legitimize what they are doing by treating them like the democracy you've just described them as. I had Kenneth Roth in here last month.
Yeah. The former head of Human Rights Watch.
Yeah, 30 years standing up to despots. And he now uses the word genocide to describe what's going on. I mean, if we take his analysis as at least valid, if not something you might agree with, then is there no point at which a government doing unspeakable things becomes a government with whom conversation is adding to the problems rather than helping to unravel them?
Personally, I don't think it adds to the problems if it's done, if the interview is in good hands.
Yeah.
I think it's difficult. I think any side, frankly, is becoming very proficient in running down the clock, in obfuscating, in filibustering, in repeating, and presenting their view at you as if that's what you're trying to ask them, and giving speeches.
Yeah.
So I agree with you. After 18 months, 19 months of this and us not being able to get into Gaza, it's very difficult. But I would never, and I do not refuse to interview an Israeli official. I want more and more. I've tried to get all the big people on my show. The problem is they don't necessarily want to interact with us. But I tell you what I do, which I feel very, very good about. I find ordinary Israelis and ordinary Palestinians, and there are a number of them, you'd be surprised by how many, who have been through decades of pain and suffering and deep, deep loss, and yet they still persist in the bonds that they have made before October 7th, and persist in hanging on to that in memory of their children and in memory of their loved ones, and in the hope of finding a peace and a security for all. And it was tested. I've spoken to many of them on Israel's side and the Palestinian side after October 7th. This sort of collaboration and hand holding and getting together and really trying to be something different to what we see from leaders on all sides of this. It persists, and that gives me hope. And I think grassroots in the end is going to be what it takes, and enlightened leadership.
That's really odd that you just said so stridently, that gives me hope, because I was about to say to you, you are a very hopeful person.
I am. You couldn't do this as long as I've done it, which is 35 years.
Yeah.
If you didn't have some belief and some optimism and some hope. Often it's really severely tested. To be honest with you, I came up with the idea for the podcast because I wanted to get out of every minute of every day being saturated by
Yes.
conflict
Yes.
and darkness and death. And I wanted to see if I could find something and somebody to talk about solutions with, because nobody wants to do that.
And there it is, a wonderful invitation to enjoy Christiane Amanpour Presents The X-Files with Jamie Rubin, and definitely not Jamie Rubin Presents The X-Files with Christiane Amanpour.
Get that straight, James.
I've got that straight. Christiane, thank you.
Thank you.